Good afternoon. I'm Courtney Graham with the Engagement Programs team here at the Art Institute of Chicago. Welcome to today's virtual member program on Mark Rothko. We'll begin with a brief review of some of the features we'll be using today. This program will be shared in presentation mode, so we have turned off video and microphones for attendees. For optimal viewing, please select full screen mode under the view options in the top right corner of your screen. Throughout the presentation, you're invited to share questions through the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. We look forward to answering some of those at the end of the presentation. Closed captions are available and could be turned on via the controls at the bottom of the screen as well. This program is being recorded, so if you'd like to revisit it in the future, you'll be welcome to do so. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our speakers. Dan Ramirez is a Chicago artist whose work has been exhibited across the US, Spain, Scotland, Mexico, Germany, and Italy. His work can be found in numerous collections, including the Museum of Contemporary Art, Chicago, the National Museum of Mexican Art, and the Art Institute of Chicago. He is currently a professor emeritus at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and was awarded a Pollock Krasner Foundation Award in 2005. Joining Dan in conversation is the Art Institute's own Caitlin Haskell, the Gary C. and Frances Comer Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art. Thank you both for being here. I will now turn things over to Caitlin.
Thank you so much, Courtney. Dan, I'm not seeing you right now. I'm going to change my view because that's going to make it easier for me to greet you and welcome you, and thank you for being in conversation this evening.
Well, good evening. I can see you pretty good here. So.
Okay, good. I can see you now too.
Oh, good.
And I'd also just like to welcome everybody who's viewing this program virtually for spending a bit of your Friday evening with us. And the occasion for our talk today is a gallery presentation at the Art Institute, Gallery 293 in the Modern Wing, that brings together the work of two artists working a generation apart, Mark Rothko and Felix Gonzalez Torres. And the space that we're looking at now in these installation views has been installed for approximately a year. It was curated by my colleague Ann Goldstein, who's the Deputy Director, Chair, and Dittmer Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art. And while it's situated within sort of a large collection presentation on the second floor of the Modern Wing, it also has the feeling of being a very discreet and sort of tightly curated conversation between two artists. And it also includes two very special loans. The gallery has 5 paintings in total by Rothko, and you can see them in these installation views that are kind of circulating now. And there's also a work by Felix Gonzalez Torres untitled 1989 that is on the top of the space, functioning almost like a frieze. And Devin, if it's possible to go back to slide 2, that might be a good one. Yeah, thank you. That's perfect. So I just wanted to sort of begin by saying that over the course of the past few months, Dan and I have been getting together in this gallery and just spending time in this space and having conversations together, thinking about them individually and also as groupings. And tonight, this evening that we're having is sort of envisioned as a continuation of that practice, albeit virtually, where as a curator and a painter, we're going to talk about some of the things that we observe here in this space, what we're attending to, what we're moved by, what we're surprised by, and how we feel sort of certain aspects of the space are functioning. And we're going to invite you to do that with us and just extend this dialogue that we've been having. So I think you've sort of been situated within this space already. And Devin, if we could go back to slide 2, I'm going to just very quickly, we can move through. So this is just sort of facing east, and then the next slide, which sort of show us just the south and the west wall. The next slide, the west and the north wall, and then back one more, south and east. And the works that we've been seeing, I'll just introduce you to them. The earliest would be on our next slide. Yes, so this is what's known as a multiform painting. It's from 1949, number 19. The next one, moving chronologically, is from 1951, a fantastic large-scale painting, almost 10 feet tall, where Rothko has sort of finally moved into his mature vocabulary and pictorial format. This is one of the two special loans that we have here. The next slide is from a painting 2 years later, 1953. It's a somewhat smaller composition, but still very large scale. It's 81 inches tall by 67 inches wide. And there's sort of this continuation of that wonderful acid green color that you see between those two paintings. The next painting chronologically is from the museum's collection, untitled Purple, White, and Red from 1953, also very large scale, 77 inches wide by 83 inches tall. And the last painting that we'll be looking at by Rothko is this untitled work from 1953 to 54. So, you know, the paintings that we're looking at, these 5 works created within a span of 5 years, right when Rothko is sort of moving into his mature practice. And then the last work is the Felix Gonzalez Torres, untitled 1989 to ongoing, often thought of as sort of a self-portrait in words that brings together events sort of from the sort of larger cultural sphere, public events with their dates, and also events from his own life. And so, Dan, with this sort of introduction to the space, I just wanted to ask you, what is it that you're seeing in this gallery today? What is it that's catching your eye and drawing you to attention?
Well, if you recall, when we first had an opportunity to enter the space physically, I guess as an artist and as a painter especially, I come to almost any exhibition that I view with a certain background about the artist already, because I've had a lot of time over a number of years, and therefore kind of certain expectations about what I might be looking for, or might see or find in the work. Hopefully something new all the time, because that's one of the things that I think a lot of us who are practicing artists or painters or whatever, also kind of, we feed off a little bit of those experiences. I guess the first thing is when you walk into the space is it's absolutely gorgeous. I mean, aesthetically, it's definitely beautiful. The luminosity, the light, the compositions, if you will, the whole installation is just beautiful to look at. And one of the nice things when we first went there was because it was just you and I, we weren't under any surveillance in terms of not being able to walk too close to the paintings or whatever. You probably remember I kind of like walked right over to one of the edges. I wanted to see what the side looked like.
You got very, very close. Yeah.
Yeah, I was looking very, very close, and partly because I'm interested in the size of works of work that I'm involved in myself, but primarily, there's a lot of given the history behind a painter like Rothko, for example. It's often characterized with a lot of angst and a lot of anxiety and so forth in terms of how issues that he was dealing with on a more personal level. Yeah. And so you bring a little bit of that kind of baggage, so to speak, to an event like this when you walk in. So all of a sudden, again, there's this beautiful luminosity, and why not? He's a painter. He's going through a number of different kind of issues with the material he works with, and he's evolving in different various ways. And also, if you recall, there was one painting in particular that I kept moving towards and spending more and more time with, because I was beginning to experience something in the work that I hadn't quite taken the same amount of time with before, for whatever reasons. I'm not sure. Maybe because I didn't have quite the opportunity to be so intimate in a room like this, was just, in this case, you and I, in this beautiful space. And so if you'll recall, again, I was kind of commenting on what was going on the surface. And I was seeing a certain kind of scumbling and talking about the different areas of scumbling that I was seeing take having actually having taken place on the canvas. And so that brought up a lot of issues for me. So, I didn't at first see the Torres frieze up along the top. It's a much more subtle kind of installation. You have to kind of look a little bit and know that it's there. It's helpful to have that information. And looking at that and kind of like going back after we left that day, I remember going back home, and I don't know if you'll remember, but we had a conversation in another context where I had commented about, gee, I got home, looked at my paintings, and I had quite a different feeling about them. And it wasn't necessarily a negative feeling so much as I think there's something going on in my work that's missing, that I've been missing over a while. And I think what happened was I was prompted by what I was looking at so closely in the Rothko paintings and recollecting from years prior that that was an issue. But what really caught my attention was wanting to look further into how these kind of transformations, this trust that Rothko put in the idea of abstraction, and both artists have a certain kind of existential component in their work, as most provocative artists do. And in Rothko's particular case, dealing with the abstract, there's a comment he makes about his work that's very important. It's an important word, I think. It's called transaction, this kind of interrelationship he wants to have with his viewer, with the work. And I think with the work is really kind of like the really fundamental thing. It's not so much with him, although he's made this work, but there's a belief and a faith in the abstract kind of forms he's worked with, that they carry a certain kind of transcendence where this work speaks on its own, if you will, but yet interacting with the viewer in such a way that the presence of the work and of the viewer start to interrelate. And this seems to have been certainly a strong ambition on his part as far as interacting with the viewer.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Dan will we'll talk a lot more about that actually, and sort of the extent to which the meaning of these works is sort of within the object, and the extent to which it's about sort of this process of viewing and having an interaction, you as a subject with the painting. But let's actually kind of go back to some of those really early observations that you made. And you were saying, looking at the sides, looking at the edges, you were looking at, and Devin, exactly. Let's move to slide 10. This is the painting that you walked right up to. And I think it was the right side, and you looked at it and you were just examining it. And what were some of those things you saw?
Well, I guess the painting is so luminous that you're almost wanting to walk through it. I mean, you could feel that. At least I could feel that. You could walk. It's kind of like a portal or a door or this open space. And I was curious as to there's so much going on in the front. There's so much of an event that's taking place, if you will, that I was curious as an object, and the way this was just sitting, just laying on the wall, up against the wall, how the entire form kind of felt, the thickness of the stretcher. And it reminds me very much of the malleability, if you will, of the surface of canvas, pushing when an artist is working with a brush, with the hand. And given what background I do have on Rothko and the things that I've read, including his art, The Artist's Reality, which was very, very helpful book when I read it many years ago, and when I read it reread recently, there's this kind of touch, this kind of sensuality that was so important to him. He talks a lot about this in the section on plasticity, I think, in The Artist's Reality, but how much that meant to him in terms of somehow him being able to get in touch with whatever these inner feelings and whatever beliefs or faith he had towards the ability of abstraction, in this case, really kind of like amorphous and nebulous forms, to carry this component that was so deep and so important to him. And so I guess wanting to see how thick it was compared to how ethereal it looked was really kind of a great contradiction in one sense. And you're looking at it and say, oh my goodness, this is just a painting. This is just a painting,
Right.
but it's still, yet it's so much more. It's really so much more. When you look at it with all this other information that I'm talking about that I bring. And again, this is really important. I think when we go in and we view a work, what we bring to it is usually what we're going to take away from it more often than not, because I think, as Rothko even says, and I think many painters would also embrace, is that, you know, I'm not quite how to say it. I'll say it this way. The paintings don't mean anything, but the meaning is in the painting that we
Right.
bring to this thing that exists in the way that it does, where we're shaking hands with the artist, we're shaking hands with what took place
Right.
in so many different instances.
Yeah, I know, I absolutely agree with you. And I think, you know, in those initial viewings, we wanted to sort of interrogate the paintings as objects, which is kind of a slightly perverse thing to do because they're just such sort of beautiful sort of visions. You want to look at them. You want to just, the color is so sensuous, the sense of the hand. You know, we tried to do some of those things, like look at it from really up close, you know, in the way that it's enveloping you. And it's just that the edges of our peripheral vision were still inside the painting. And we were thinking about things like, you know, how high is it hung off the ground? You know, they tend to be very, very low in this installation. And we were thinking about things like, gosh, what else? You know, how far does it project off the wall? What is it about the way the room is lit that is causing it to feel slightly animated? You know, that they feel like they're still sort of alive in some ways, that they're shifting and moving as our eyes are having different optical, you know, perceptual encounters with them. And then we did move over to the purple, white, and red painting, which is really just such a remarkable work. And that one, you know, maybe Devin, could we go to the view of that on slide 9? Thanks. Yeah, that one, just the interaction of color and the sort of the depth of field that you get in this work was just something that, you know, I think it really spoke to both of us. And there was a sense of almost searching in it, maybe. But I'll let you talk a little bit, Dan, about, you know, what it was about this particular painting that was just like so gripping on that day.
Well, no, I think your insights are right on. I mean, there is this again, these components of the handwork that's taking place in the painting, the luminosities and things of that nature. But you mentioned something, and this is what really kind of, when I left that day, set me off to try to look further into what it is I was experiencing that particular day when we were looking at the work. And that is, we were talking about the purple section of the painting, which I kind of found really interesting in the way he was moving with his hands and the brush and that, as well as that little white kind of outlining of that central surface, whitish kind of center. And you said something, somehow we kind of like jumped to the chapel paintings about, maybe this is why he used purple. And that really got my mind kind of moving along like, well, yeah. When I think of his work in total, and if I think of the let's call it well, for lack of a better term, the end game of the chapel paintings being so far down the road near the end of his life as a painter, was that I found as a painter, but the curiosity it brought to mind to me was, if this artist, Rothko, has invested so much belief in the idea of touch, in the idea of the sensual, and how much that means in terms of how that presents itself in the activity of making a painting and using that surface. What happens when, here you are, you've got this, there's this painting, this 3-tiered painting, let's call it. When you're standing in front of it close, like we were that day, and we have a slide. Which slide is it? It's number 20. If we can show number 20 for a second, where we see Rothko in front of this large painting. Now, he talks often about how important it is for the viewer to be close to his paintings, very near, not too far. And I can understand that because, again, my experience was, and we were talking about that at the time, that I could all of a sudden see things I wasn't seeing from further away. I was engaged with the scale, which was very important. It was large, something he also found very important, not unlike someone like Barnett Newman, who talked about scale and its relationship to the human body as well, and investing that kind of presence into the work. So there he is, he's painting and he's touching. So I can see that he's got his feet, he can feel that, and whatever is going through his mind, gosh only knows. But then I thought, well, you know, what happens when you step back and you move back real far? All of a sudden, if you're focused on how important the surface is, how important you're moving your hand with the brush, and that has such great power and meaning for you in terms of how you're dealing with whatever thoughts of abstraction or whatever the thought might be, and the pushing and the malleability of the surface, the absorption of the paint. Then you step back and you've got these three forms. He's a painter and I'm a painter, and I'm saying to myself, well, now he's got a problem. He's dealing with composition. He's got these three forms. What does he decide? Well, I think I'll take that one out. I think I'll move this one over. And then the more I thought about that, I began to think about the Seagram paintings. Later, when he started moving more towards the purplish colors, and they're actually more monochromatic. And you don't see as much of the other shapes, where he's beginning to eliminate that, because in my mind, that surface was still so important. That movement with the hand, with the brush, with the sensuality, with that investing all of that into that piece. And then the culmination of which you find these works in the Rothko Chapel. It's total brushwork. It's total the hands-on. And it seems to be like that really kind of carries this sense of what he was trying to impart into the paintings himself. There's a kind of a time-related sequence of events that are taking place as his work unfolds. If you could go back to the, I guess it was the orange painting, but we have a slide of it where it also shows the Torres frieze above it. I think that one right there. That really got me into thinking how, as you pointed out earlier, the Torres piece as a self-portrait. Now, of course, the history behind this, as we both know, it's an untitled self-portrait. There's certificates that the museum is given, that they have the option to add more to it, take things away
participatory
from it.
in that way.
They don't necessarily have to be in sequence. They can unfold over time, and it's important for the artist that the viewer is dealing with moments of time that they can recollect and go back, where they're participating with the artist in a way that is not dissimilar to what Rothko is dealing with, and asking his viewer to come and bring themselves to that work that now exists for them, where the painting not only is, but as an art historian once said, the painting not only is, but it is you. It becomes you, just in the same way that the Torres piece becomes you when you begin to work through it. And your relation and your contact with the artist is so personal and so invested, but it's really coming back to the viewer. You begin to become yourself. You grow from that and finding more and more about yourself as you're moving through it, which I think is quite an accomplishment on the part of both artists in that respect.
Absolutely. So we're gonna transition for a moment, but I want to go back to slide 20, which was the image of Rothko in his studio in New York. And Dan, you were already starting to point out these things. So obviously the presence of the hand, the scale of the physical support of the painting, how that relates to his size, sort of a human scale, and the painting itself being larger than that. These light sources, both coming from above and from the side, thinking about the way that the surface is going to respond to light, and then also his proximity to the painting. And these are phenomenological aspects of engagement with any painting, but they become so key to the meaning of Rothko's work, or the meaning that will derive from Rothko's work. And of course, this is a great image that you selected, because it's from the exact moment when many of the paintings in this presentation in the modern wing are also created. But the other thing that's happening at that moment, so 1 year after this photograph, Roscoe would be invited by the Art Institute's curator, Catherine Koo, to have a solo exhibition at the museum. And so as we were sort of asking ourselves questions about, what's taking place in this space, what are we feeling here, how do these historical objects act on us in the present, we also started going back to some of these historical documents. And Devin, if we could go to slide 13, you'll see here this wonderful, I love the design of this press release from the fall of 1954, announcing an early exhibition of Roscoe's work. He referred to it as the first museum presentation of his mature works, and it was a significant turning point for him. And it's just sort of wonderful that our own archives and our own institution has this history with him. And if we move to the next slide, you can see some images of Catherine Koo on the left in her office, and on the right on the Women's Board Grand Staircase with Marcel Duchamp there in 1951. So approximately the period that we're thinking about, just a little bit before. And you'll see that in the spring of 54, and we can go to the next slide, Devin, Catherine Koo and Roscoe began a wonderful exchange, and it's an exchange that we're going to spend some time with. So this is April. Catherine's writing to Mark saying, you know what, I've just got this wonderful new exhibition series approved. You'll be first. Mark Toby's going to be second. Do you want to do this? Do you want to have a show at the Art Institute? And Roscoe responds in May that he is very much interested in this. And then if we go to the next slide, you'll see this is a little bit longer, and I'm going to read from it. They start having a really serious dialogue about what do these pictures mean. And Roscoe says in July 54 to Catherine Koo, you write that what you would really like to know is what I'm after, how I work, and why I've chosen the particular form which I use. I hope that some kind of answer to these questions will be implicit in our correspondence before it's completed. May I suggest, however, that at this time we abandon any preconceived notions of what ought to be said and printed in sort of the exhibition essay that she would write. Rather than create the pretense of answers to questions which either should not be answered or which are essentially unanswerable, I would like to find a way of indicating the real involvements in my life out of which my pictures flow and into which they must return. If I can do that, the pictures will slip into their rightful place. For I think that I can say with some degree of truth that in the presence of the pictures, my preoccupations are primarily moral, and that there is nothing to which they seem less involved than aesthetics, history, or technology. To that end, nothing would be more stimulating to me if you could find some way of indicating the real nature of your own involvement with the works of art and ideas, which, if I'm at all a good judge, are very intense and human. And they'll continue, and I'll read a little bit more, but essentially we have sort of two paths of thought, or two sort of topics of inquiry that their dialogue goes over. One is, what can be said about these paintings? And if we're going to be talking about the meaning of them, is that in them as objects, or is it in this encounter? Is it in this interaction between the beholder and the object? And then the other thing that takes place is a real serious conversation about how to install them to create the sort of place where a real sort of significant encounter can be had. And so actually, let's stay on that July 14, 1954 slide for just a moment more, if we could. Thanks. So he continues, so forgive me if I continue with my misgivings, but I feel it's important to state them. There is the danger that in the course of this correspondence, an instrument will be created which will tell the public how the pictures should be looked at and what to look for. While on the surface, this may seem an obliging and helpful thing to do, the real result is the paralysis of the mind and the imagination, and for the artist, a premature entombment. Hence my abhorrence for forewords and explanatory data. And if I must place my trust somewhere, I would invest it in the psyche of the sensitive observer who is free of these conventions of understanding. I would have no apprehensions about the use he or she, the observer, would make of these pictures for the needs of his or her own spirit. For if there is both need and spirit, there is bound to be a real transaction, which is this sort of encounter that's taking place. So, and if we get to the next slide, still in, and actually let's go one further. from there. Yeah. So this, later in July of 54, Rothko is asking about the question of not what ought to be said about his works, but what is it that you can say? He says the question and answer method at once presented insuperable difficulties. For the question of what the work means imposes its own rhetoric and syntax upon the answer, regardless of whether this rhetoric can serve the truth. Whereas I have to set for myself the problem of finding the most exact rhetoric for these specific pictures. And he says that he doesn't want to think about discussions of space because that comes with all sorts of trappings. But this is sort of, it's this futile battle, and really he wants to sort of not define in advance what the works are going to mean, but allow this to create, to be created in space. And over the course of the summer, they start looking at blueprints of how these paintings are going to be installed together. And Devin, we could go back one slide. There's a really nice drawing of how these works are going to fit in space. You can see that they're very sort of densely installed. They're trying to place 9 paintings within a very tight space. But over time, Rothko starts giving some clues to Catherine Koo about how he would like them to be encountered. So he's saying, he hangs his largest pictures so that they must first be encountered at close quarters, so that the first experience is within the picture. This may well give the key to the observer of the ideal relationship between himself and the rest of the picture. I also hang the pictures rather low than high, and particularly in the case of the largest ones, often as close to the floor as is feasible, for that's the way they're painted, as we saw in his studio. So I was going to ask Dan, could you just speak a little bit about maybe some times that people have asked you to sort of pin down or put into words the meanings of your pictures, and how you respond to that? Is it this sort of premature paralysis and entombment, or do you sympathize with Rothko or not in these kind of responses?
I think I sympathize from a lot of different perspectives here. First of all, how it's nice if you can really have that kind of control over how your work is going to look and be installed, especially if you're not there, because most of us, I think most artists, are very particular about whether or not the kind of installation that their work is presented is the most sufficient for bringing out the content. And usually the artist kind of feels, well, I know best what my work is about. I know best what my art, how it should be put up. And you don't always get that kind of control. So number one, that's a kind of an iffy situation that an artist finds, that artists find themselves in quite often, I think. Not always, but sometimes. Ask me, can you run that by me just one more time? I lost my focus just a little bit.
Well, it was, no, it's okay. It's sort of, when an artist is in the position that Rothko was put in, where a curator is saying, tell me about what these works mean. And maybe this is something that's more germane to, a conversation taking place in the mid-50s. But, there's, people want to know what the meaning is in the object. And Rothko's really saying, no, it's going to be about the encounter. It's going to be about this transaction that takes place between the observer and the work that I've made. And I guess that kind of like brings us back to this project that we've been doing, over the course of the fall, where, we come to this installation. It's constant, right? But we're changing within it, and we've sort of seen different things, over the course of these viewings. And I guess maybe I'll actually phrase it to you this way. Could you talk about how the installation has maybe changed for you over the course of these viewings that we've done, how that, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to get, I guess getting back first to, how do I feel when somebody asks me about how the work functions from my point of view? I'm always open to simply saying exactly, what I think I'm doing, how I'm making up certain stories to myself at times, how I'm paying more attention to the surface, there's a whole number of things that take place, and I'm fine with doing that. But I think ultimately what we're kind of getting towards is that there's a point at which no matter what you say, not everyone's going to necessarily feel or see that, nor do they have to. That when you finally finish a work of art, or in this specific case, a painting or a frieze, such as the Torres frieze, which actually has a little different component. But getting back to the painting, is that you have no control over this anymore. It's now this object that's out there, and yes,
in the world, yeah,
it's in the room. And as much as Rothko might want us to walk straight up to it, we may not. So how is that going to affect the work? So yes, the curatorial responsibility, in terms of the installation especially, I would imagine that the curator is certainly very, very much aware of who this artist is, what the components are, and what they would like to bring out. But then you're presented with a situation where the curator is also beginning to having to make certain interpretations as well as the viewer who just goes to the painting and looks at it itself, even with the historical background one already has. And so trying to be, there's no perfect here. You can't get a perfect, but you can. But we do have this painting, which is the magic, which is the real thing. And as you say, we're in a process of becoming, okay, as we are just as human beings. These paintings, as odd as it is to be said, are also always in a process of becoming, because the paintings that kind of tend to provoke us because they seem some ways to interact with the time that they're in, even if they were made many, many years before. There's something we bring to it because we're contemporary.
Well, absolutely. And I think we'll probably turn this over to some viewer questions. But what I think what you're starting to say is that the choices that a curator brings to this space also affects the meaning that one is going to derive from the pictures, right? So the painting, the 1951 painting that we see on the east wall there with a beautiful red horizontal band, that's hung 11 inches off the ground. What if you move that 2 feet off the ground? Well, it's an entirely different encounter, right? What if you didn't have it along this long axis? Those are things that Mark Rothko doesn't control. He also doesn't control whether there's another artist in the space, right? I mean, this is kind of a wonderful situation where, if your eye is sort of looking at a usual sort of space where paintings are hung, it seems like a one artist room, but then you get these little glimmers of the Felix Gonzalez Torres, and it sets it into a slightly different resonance. And the same thing with, moving in the other direction, vice versa. It's also true that if you're used to sort of expecting a space of contemplation for Rothko, sort of quiet, sort of thoughtfulness, maybe you're bringing that set of mind to Felix Gonzalez Torres in a way that, you might not have otherwise. But
and if we can reflect just a little bit further on the Torres situation, he's in my opinion, a much more enviable kind of situation because of the way he structured his art, by allowing the museum to alter the work in any way they please. For example, whether it's the frieze and how many words they use. I mean, as this self-portrait started out, it was only, I believe, six. I wrote this down. Oh yeah, it has 6 entries, 7 entries and 7 dates. Over the years, I think that in 2002, when it was exhibited in San Francisco, it had 66 entries and 66 dates.
It fluctuates, right?
To fluctuate. And he gives the museum, and therefore the installation, if you will, the opportunity to become with it while it's actually being put up. That artwork is functioning virtually all the time. And so there's no real concern about what's going to be lost in the content. The content remains right there. There's no concern about that. That the museum is a part of that process.
Right. And I hate to cut us short on this, but I know that Courtney has questions too. So let's see if some of the viewer questions lead us in a different direction.
Yes, thank you both so much. And you've covered a couple of the questions already. So we are on the same page. Fantastic. But this is a wonderful question that came in. This person loved the chronological introduction to the Rothko works. Could you comment on the so-called transitions that you see and how these may relate to what's going on in his life through this period of time?
Goodness. So, I mean, I think we can, if we want to sort of look at the multiform painting, so that's sort of the one that is before he's hit his, what we would understand as sort of the classic format of the horizontal bands within a large scale field. I mean, speaking art historically, prior to this moment, there are people who would have associated Rothko most closely with kind of tenets of surrealism, right? I mean, he's moving from being a painter who has some figurative and symbolic elements in his work to a mode of painting that is going to be that's fully abstract, right? So I mean, it's the moment of Rothko becoming a color field painter. And that's really, I mean, between the 1949 multiform painting and the 1951 painting, and maybe Devin, do we want to go to slide 2 again, where we can see just that long view onto the 1951? Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, this is kind of what we have before us is Rothko becoming Rothko, and as Dan pointed out, there would be subsequent chapters. The palette gets darker. The Seagram's paintings, it becomes more monochromatic. But this is, I think, an artist who is trying to make a painting that is even less determined than it had been before, more open to possibilities, and is going to have this existential character to it, where the viewer is going to have a response to it as color and brushwork and its relationship sort of to the architecture around it. I don't know, Dan, do you have
No, I think the way you're unfolding that, I think, is quite accurate as he's moving through the transitions in his work. I could offer this by stepping maybe back a little further prior to the multiform and how that multiform comes about. Rothko does talk about, and this is something that I gleaned out of his, not gleaned, but read in his The Artist's Reality. And I found it really, really quite remarkable because it helped me understand his move towards abstraction, if you will. And that is that he focuses on the work of Giotto. And as we know, those of us who have read some background on him, Rothko traveled quite a bit in Europe and Italy and so forth. But when his focus on Giotto was in relationship to some critical writing about Giotto, where on the one hand, Giotto is being criticized for not being able to understand space in the so-called more traditional way we understand now in terms of how things really kind of unfold space in reality. Yeah. And then Rothko takes the side really in the readings of Berenson, who really embraces Giotto in the sense of Giotto's tactility, his lack of detail, but his sense of allowing you to feel the grass, feel the air, to feel the space. And I think without question, as Rothko embraces this to such an extent that I think it just feeds him even more and the faith-driven kind of drive he has about the role that texture, the role that and the roles that a certain kind of sensuality can play, and what he would call the plasticity, the malleability of the process of the instruments that he works with to bring them to this point. And you see this all start to unfold. And I think the point that you're making there, Dan, is that when you're saying that Rothko's reading Bernard Berenson and thinking about these early Italian painters, that before the moment of what we would call scientific perspective or Renaissance perspective, there's a more intuitive aspect, right? And that Giotto is working in sort of a comparable human way, where he's feeling his way through. Nothing is so exact; it's approximate. And what that means is that you're not relying on a system; you're relying on yourself in that moment to make a decision.
And I
Right.
think that's something that Rothko really admired, and that was something that he was moving toward in his own work.
Yeah. I think Rothko would say you don't see reality, you feel it.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of like why you see these forms of his kind of, he's abstracting, and he's abstracting from himself. At a certain point, he's abstracting his own forms to where they're finding nothing but those brushstrokes, because that's, I think, ultimately for me, from my own personal point of view of him as an artist and as a painter, he really fulfills for himself as far as he could possibly go. And I've often asked myself how frustrating that must finally be. If you recall, when we looked initially at the purple, white, red painting, I said to you, this painting is absolutely fantastic. And I felt it was fantastic because it was, and I don't mean this in a pejorative sense at all, it's unresolved. It's not a resolved painting. He is still searching. He's not there yet. He has really got himself in a bind. And I just felt that in the work. And I'm convinced in my own mind that that's ultimately why he ended up in the manner that he did. And not unlike how Felix Torres can find a way to structure his work, where you're finally involved in his work in such a way that work just never ends, really. It's never really resolved or unresolved. It's infinite.
Yeah.
It's infinite. And both of their works kind of come across that way to me.
Well, there is that. And I think, it's funny that the slide's no longer on the screen, but just the, thinking about feeling and just really sort of almost just like essential primal things of, what you can intuit and what you can see in the most sort of basic way, getting back to these sort of most essential feelings of, the pressure of the purple field and the force of these sort of gray bands, and that there is sort of a sense of sensation and emotion that's taking place here, that is still in the process of being, it's reacting, right?
Absolutely. I mean, my feeling towards that is that, I was almost amused, like that painting of the white around that form's like, well, maybe this will work. Maybe this will make this have this thing, because he is still dealing with a composition here. Again, this is the size of the painting, I think, makes it a big difference in terms of how your mind begins to function, how your emotions begin to just climb on board, so to speak, to what's happening in front of you. And he's dealing with a composition on the one hand and still having such strong feelings about getting there, whatever there was. I think he got there personally. In the chapel paintings, I think he got there. And anyway, that's kind of like my take on it.
Well, Courtney, do
you,
we have time
Dan.
for one more, or are we?
Sure, yeah. As a means of wrapping up, I think you both kind of touched on this a little bit, but someone asked, what has more value, the intended content of the artist or the interaction of the viewer and the work?
Well, I think what's so interesting is that, maybe it's a false premise to say that there is an intended meaning, right? And I think that's what Rothko is really fighting against in the correspondence with Catherine Koo, where she's sort of, deferring to the artist to say, what was the intention here? And this is one of those first historical moments where you start to say that there's the intended consequence of the painting is that there will be another person who feels something from it. And Rothko doesn't want to limit that, but he wants to, create the situation with Catherine Koo as his curator where a real encounter can be had.
Yeah, I think intention sometimes is fool's gold, because you may have an intention when you start, but when you begin to release yourself to the process that's taking place before you, and things start to change, and you start to use and allow your imagination to interact with what's taking place, give yourself that kind of freedom, things change in such a way where, and maybe this gets back to like when someone asks you to explain your work, can you explain it? You have to find a way to like, what moment did my mind change 1,000 times? So
well,
it's kind of interesting.
No, sorry. And what's kind of brilliant about that is, the relationship to Felix Gonzalez Torres. where there's literally a transfer of authority to the museum to select the moments, right? It's always got to be a mixture of some sort of public events and some personal events, but he's not prescribing it, right? He's making it about a collaborative endeavor, and I think Rothko is really there with him, and that's sort of in these letters, very eloquent, well worded, very rhetorically deft letters, where Rothko is saying, I'm not going to tell you what this is about. You know, we'll know in October after they're installed. You know, that's a little bit of what he's shifting us toward, a different conception of the art object.
You read something from the Catherine Q letter earlier, and if you recall, I this morning, I think or sometime during the afternoon, I texted back to you about something you had said, and I told you I was going to ask you to state it again, that there was something I wanted to add to it. And I think where we're at right now in terms of what you're just kind of like elaborated on, I think I'd like to, if you would just allow me to read something that you wrote, the text to me earlier today.
Okay.
Because, and then I want to just add just a little something to that. I think it kind of will deal with both the Torres and with Rothko in a way that I think is important. If I may, you said that
sure.
A space where the monumental, the shared historical, and the personal start to blend. We can look at these objects as touchstones of modernism. The creation of each was a major historical event, but they are also works that register our personal histories and states of minds in an ongoing and evolving way. And in that sense, they remain in the present tense. And, you know, in terms of Torres's works, he figured out a way for his, and basically here what I'm doing here is I'm quoting out an art historian who I read something. Her name is Miwan Kwan, to give her credit for the article she wrote on Torres. But I think it really fits into what you just said as well, because Rothko, like Torres, is asking for a transition, for a transaction between the viewer and him, but he's also involving the museum in such a way that in public spaces in such a way that's a little bit different than Rothko, but still after the same kind of interaction between the viewer and the work itself. And it's something that's always in the process of becoming. It's always, the painting is becoming. We are becoming. Where Rothko is trusting abstract painting in a static object, we're finding Torres dealing with it in a different form in terms of the way he presents his work. But this historian used was quoted in this way. Let me just say this. It's that Torres figured out a way for his artworks to continue being, not as static, frozen objects, but as an always becoming. And he insinuated himself into history in the same way. He didn't try to declare, I existed or I was here. He worked hard not to become a statue, but to be absorbed into the world as itself, a form of becoming, to become part of others being limitlessly forever. I think Rothko and he both, that's kind of like what we get from them. That's what they allow us to have. They leave us with this residue of their lives that was so important to them in the ways that it was important, that when we come, our expectations is to know what they were all about. In some respects, we are curious at times, but the fact of the matter is we go there, we see that painting, and we bring our being and we become again. We renew ourselves as human beings each time we find ourselves in front of works of art that are provocative. And we see this all the time, I think, in all the museums and all the wonderful installations we see at the different places that we are allowed to view that. And I think we see that here in this particular installation, which I think is terrific.
Maybe that's a wonderful note to end on. Yeah.
I was just going to say that's the perfect plug. Hopefully folks will make their way to the museum and see the works for themselves and become part of it themselves. So thank you both so very much for this discussion, and thank you to our members for joining us today. The installation of these Rothko works, along with the Gonzalez Torres, can be found in Gallery 292 on the second floor of the Modern Wing. For more information on upcoming virtual events, please visit us online at artic.edu and look for our monthly e-news in your inboxes. We look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you.